Alright, you guys. I wanted to share um, something important, but I kind of lost my train of thought on this. So, I feel like I've often made videos responding to, I guess popular ideologies within Christianity or like apologetics debates. But I feel like I wanted to make this video. So, I feel like there's, I don't know, there's so many different perspectives I could go into on this. You have a lot of atheists, you have a lot of ex Christians, ex Muslims, ex whatever. There's a lot of opinions surrounding religion and religious beliefs. And something that I feel like is interesting is I personally feel like I could never be an atheist. And I feel like I've heard people, well, let me go back a little bit. So there was a video I watched. I feel like it was maybe a viral video Alex O'Connor made where he basically makes the clip or says he tried really hard to believe in God, he just couldn't. And I feel like I have the opposite opinion of that. Like, I couldn't not believe in God. Like, I just really don't think I could ever be an atheist. And one thing that I think is really important for any Christian is to question their belief. So I want to make something very clear. As a Christian, my belief in God is not just blind faith, the way some people think, oh, well, you just grew up in church, you were just taught to believe in God, therefore you believe in God. I feel like every Christian's faith gets tested at some point, and I feel like if you've never doubted your belief in God, you don't really know, or your faith in God, you don't really know you have it. And so I've definitely questioned what I believe, but this is what I want to explain. I feel like this is my personal perspective just from my own experience. I would say that when I was angry at God because something in my life didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, are the main times I didn't want to believe in God. So, breaking that down, the root cause of my disbelief was anger at a situation not turning out how I wanted it to. And that anger or being upset over a situation that didn't turn out the way I wanted it to was what led to me questioning my faith in God, and maybe also not wanting to believe God exists. Now, I will say for me personally, there's, I mean, there's, I would say I haven't experienced a lot of trauma in life. And maybe that's why, some people maybe would say, well, you haven't gone through as horrible experience as other people. That's why, you're not questioning the goodness of God because, and I feel like that's where this entire idea of how any amount of suffering in this world, people equate suffering any type of suffering that happens in the world, um, I feel like is why a lot of people choose not to believe in God, because they create the notion of, if they're suffering, God can't be good or God can't be loving. And I feel like I've sat with, this question for a lot of time. And I honestly feel like if this question stumps you, um, I think that there's two things I think that are true. I think suffering is a painful experience, right? Like when someone is suffering, that's not a fun experience for someone to have. And so there's this, I guess, notion that a when you're experiencing suffering, it's, horrible. It's like, who would wish this on anybody? And so, where this idea that, a loving God wouldn't allow suffering to exist, I feel like comes from this notion that of a deceptive, harmful Christianity that claims um, a loving God wouldn't allow suffering. But this is what I think a lot of people misunderstand in this entire, and I feel like you come to this conclusion only when you don't acknowledge the reality of sin. And this is something I stress so much, because I feel like if we're arguing about God, if we're arguing about the Bible, if we're arguing about Christianity, and don't point out how God views sin, because people don't take sin seriously, we often come up with ways to justify our sinful nature. Well, it's not our fault we were born into sin. Therefore, God, what right does God have to punish me for my sin if I didn't have a choice in being born into sin? Where there's always an excuse behind, and there's no accountability, and there's no, I've done anything wrong, I just was born and come to exist. I think, and I've said this a lot of it boils down to people don't like the concept or the notion of sin or being sinners. They also don't like the notion or the concept of hell. Now, this is what a lot of people misunderstand about sin and about hell. Hell is eternal separation from God. God is not going to force you to be in his presence for an eternity. A loving God does not force his presence on to people. And what hell is, and why is hell suffering? Why is hell horrendous? Because without God, you reject all the goodness of God as well. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that there's an opposing force to good. Um, just like evil is the absence of goodness, darkness is the absence of light. This is what I want people to realize. It's not that God isn't good, it's that um the absence of God is what is evil. The absence of light is what is darkness. So if you simply remove God from the actual picture and from the world and from society, nothing good is left, essentially. And people don't ever acknowledge the uh, I don't even want to say duality of it, because it's not really a duality. It's that God is the creator of all things, and if you remove him from the picture, you're left with, what's left is emptiness. It's void of the light, it's void of love, it's void of goodness. Um and it's like God gave us the free will to reject him as our creator. And it's like people don't realize what they're asking for, essentially, because they don't trust the goodness of God, or they pin God being loving. They try to diminish God being loving into a love that allows their sin to go unpunished. And it's like if people ignore that God is righteous and holy and just, if you ignore the holiness, righteousness, and justice that God requires, to paint a picture of God just being this all loving person that just loves people regardless of their sins. And it's like God is all loving. Yes, he loves people despite their sin, but he does not love their sin, because sin is evil. Sin is us committing acts of evil to one another. Um And it's like, I don't know what the best way to explain it other than just to say, like, when we are our sin separates us from God, because God is perfect, holy, and righteous. So when we do something that is void of the goodness of God, when we do things that go directly against God, that is what sin is. Sin is actively going against the goodness of God. Um, and then, you know, the seriousness of that, I feel like it's also often ignored in a lot of, I listen to, why I'm no longer Christian, why I'm no longer this, why I left Christianity as a pastor. And a lot of it, well, I think a lot of it is people have this idea of, they want to fit God into their own ideas of God. And I think personally for me, what it boils down to is they want God to love them without them having to change anything about their life. They want a love that allows for sin. They want God's love to just be acceptance of people, even if they're actively sinning and doing things that go against God. So, one way, I guess, to paint this understanding the best is, let's talk about how laws govern people, right? Like every country you live in, there's a law of the land that governs those people. And if you break those laws and you're found guilty of breaking that law, the governing body is allowed to enact punishment against you for breaking their laws. Like you can't go, I don't know anywhere in the world you can go where it's legal for you to just do whatever you want without consequences. If whatever governing body finds you guilty of breaking a law, they have a right to punish you for committing a crime. Excuse me. So in our own governing bodies, we can learn and understand the governing that God also has for the world. God created a law that governs everybody, basically. And the laws that he created are, what's the best way I can say it? I think, like, the law that God created is like the ultimate law. It's the ultimate, the highest law of the land. Like, I think that's like why a lot of governments don't like Christians, because Christians will ultimately hold the laws of the Bible over the laws of a governing official, regardless. Like, we're always going to prioritize God's law over, is the final law, is the most important law, is the ultimate law that resides over everything. So, like, if a government, decided to allow something or change a law that, doesn't line up with the Bible, basically, a Christian's still going to uphold the laws of the Bible. And that's the reason a lot of, communist, fascist governments attack religious people and Christians specifically, because there's this understanding that a Christian is always going to hold God's laws over their governing countries, because you believe in the ultimate authority of God, as because God is the creator of all things. So I don't know. That's just another tidbit about it. But one thing I just want to really say is that if you are, when I was questioning, I guess, my belief in God or my faith in God, the main thing about it, and I feel like everybody's reason for, believing in God or not being believing in God is going to be personal to them. It's a subjective reason why, but a lot of times I feel like it has to do with people not liking an outcome of a situation. They wanted something to go differently. And let me tell you something recently that I, experienced kind of outside of. So this man was sharing a tragic story of his son who got hit by, I think he said, like, a tree fell on his son's head, and he was in the hospital, and he made a TikTok video asking Christians to pray for his son. I saw that video, right? And I just immediately start praying to God for this son. And then I didn't check to see if there was an update first. Just started praying, asking God to perform a miracle on his son, to heal him, have a full recovery for his son to be okay. I click on the page and see that there was an update already posted that his son had passed away. So think about this. I'm praying. I see this video of this guy asking Christians to pray for his son. I already am praying for his son, but I'm praying for his son, not aware that the son has already passed away, that there's already been an update. And so this is where I feel like your faith is either going to be proven or it's going to be broken. It's either going to be strengthened or broken in situations like this, because this is a situation where this guy wanted people to pray for his son to live, right? That's what he wanted. That's what he was hoping the result would be. But the end result was, unfortunately, the doctors were not able to save his son, and he ended up passing away. So we as Christians can do two things. A Christian in this situation is going to do two things. You can either say, God, you didn't answer my prayer. You didn't do what I wanted you to do, what I asked you to do. I reached out to all of these Christians. I asked them to pray for my son. I asked him. I wanted him to be healed. I wanted you to prove to me that you could do this for my son. And you failed me, because that's not what happened. You know, and that leads to a life of rejection of God and anger at God. And that person could say, you know what, I don't believe in you because I prayed for something and you didn't answer my prayer the way I wanted you to. Therefore, God must not exist. That, I feel like, is the situation that turns a lot of people into ex-Christians. There's a deep personal um experience, I guess, where they feel like their belief in God was tested because God failed them and didn't show up for them in a situation the way they wanted God to show up for them. So they ultimately decide, well, because God didn't show up for me the way I wanted him to, therefore God doesn't exist. But this is the other side of it. Does God doesn't always answer our prayers the way we want him to. And I feel like as believers, you're either submitted to God's will or you're not. And when you're submitted to God's will, this is the hard part of being a Christian. You don't always get what you want. God is not always going to, God is not a genie, basically, the way some people treat him. And, we might pray for something, but we have to ultimately trust that God knows better in some situations than we do. And this is where having your faith gets tested, because you're either going to submit to the will of God or you're going to continue in your rejection of God's will and say, well, that's not, I don't want God's will. I want my will to be done in my life, and be upset and angry and resentful of God because you felt like I said, God failed you in some way. And that's what I'm saying. When a when your faith gets tested as a Christian, that's often what it comes down to. Is this person, he could have said, well, because God didn't save my son, after thousands of Christians, by the way, are praying for his son, myself included, and I was really sad to see the update. But you know what? I said, God knows better in this situation. God's timing. It's like you have to trust God through the good and the bad as a true Christian. You can't pick and choose. If your faith in God is dependent on your life being perfect and never having to suffer and never having anything go wrong in your life, that's a very weak faith. It's a very weak faith, but it's also a very limited faith. You only believe in God so long as everything goes your way, so long as you get your way in all things. That's not being truly submitted to God's will. And so when you actually listen to testimonies of Christians who deal with and overcome tragic situations, there's so many, and it's like true Christian, true Christianity is not an easy walk. True Christianity is not, I get my way, everything happens exactly how I want it to. True Christianity is having to trust God through some of the worst experiences in your life, and trusting that those experiences serve a purpose and have a meaning. And often you grow a lot more. There are certain things you can't learn, and this is where I feel like my trust in God and the goodness of God is what keeps me going through, and what keeps a lot of Christians going through tragic situations, because is your trust in the goodness of God is what you hold on to in a situation where that is tragic, where it seems like this is such a unnecessary loss of my child, right? That's what that person, he lost his baby. I think the son was only like 3 or 4 years old. That's a tragic loss of a life. But what you have to remember, and what I have to remember, is that God created that life. God loves that life more than us, more than any of us on this earth. And God knows better about what that person needs than anybody else. I also think it's remembering that life is not promised, that every breath we have and take on this earth is a gift from God. And a lot of people don't like that because they don't like the notion that their life is not their own. But truthfully, when you understand God as a creator, everything we have is literally because of God. when you believe in God, if you believe God is the creator of all things, right? And I feel like this is why I often talk about, you know, I personally don't like, if you're going to argue against God, it should be objective at least, you know. God, the God of the Bible says he is the creator of all things. And I feel like God being the creator of all things means he has every right to give life and take life because he owns it at the end of the day. He chose to create that life. Therefore, he also has the right to end that life. And this is the best way I can describe it. Think of, a coder. You know, if I code a program and, for whatever reason I decide, you know what, I actually don't like this program anymore, that the person who coded that program, who created that program, has every right to end the program, to terminate that program, to erase that program. And what can the program do about it at the end of the day? The program is literally a result of the creator itself. So I feel like God as the creator, people often misunderstand, like, why, why is God allowed, I guess, to enact justice when humans create crimes against other humans and humanity. And I feel like, a lot of people point out in the Old Testament how, God was wiping out entire civilizations and how they think that's so unfair. And funnily enough, I'm like, when we ask God to stop, I always want to ask people maybe a question: what other way is God supposed to stop evil without destroying slash ending the lives of evil people? Because, if death didn't exist, and this is something I mentioned in another video, people could do evil forever. There's literally no end to evil when an evil person lives forever. Imagine, Hitler never died. He would probably still be, it's just like, that's something, I mean, I guess that's a way to think about it, but it's just like, personally for me, I'm glad that there is an end to evil at times. I'm glad evil people can't live forever. And I think what people have a hard time, I guess, coming to terms with is that we're actually not as good as people like to think they are. But anyways, let me go back to this story because I didn't actually fully explain what I wanted to say. So I remember reading that, and even I'm like, this wasn't my child, but I'm like, truly God hears my prayers, and all of these Christians praying for his son, to live and be healed, and for God to show his miraculous healing powers. But that's not what actually ended up happening. So that's the part of Christianity that I think is hard, and that makes or breaks a true believer in Christ, or someone whose belief in God was all about, like, this is why I feel like prosperity gospel is pretty harmful, because the prosperity gospel is not the true gospel. The true gospel is that you're going to endure suffering. Suffering is pretty much guaranteed for all Christians. The Bible tells us that. So this man loses his son, and through that loss, though, he still continues to trust God. And this is where it's like, you have to trust God. God knew that was his son's time to leave this earth. And it's like, we don't get to decide how long we have on this earth. And I feel like that's something that often gets ignored in all of these situations. It's like, we already know we have a finite amount, am I saying that word correctly? A finite amount of time on this earth. No one is promised forever on this earth. God gives us access to eternity, not here on earth, but in heaven. And I think, for the non religious people, you know, every any type of suffering that seems cold. Why do young people die? Why do old young people die? Why do kids get cancer? Why do all of these horrible things happen? And it's like there's certain things where we can't understand fully because we're not God. And I feel like God, this is where I feel like it's just like it's a question of faith at the end of the day, and it's a test of your faith. Because if your faith in God is only so long as everything in your life is going well, that's not a strong faith, that's a weak faith. Your faith is actually the strongest when you're going through storms, when you're going through trials, when you're going through tragedy. The Bible says God is close and near to the heavy hearted, those with who are burdened, those who are weeping, those who are mourning. God is close to those who are mourning. And that's something that until you're in that position, you're not going to feel that. But I often think people's anger around God not showing up the way they wanted him to, God not saving, God not stopping that evil thing, God not turning that thing around the way that person wanted to, is the reason a lot of people stop believing in God. Um, and reject their faith because, like I said, they wanted God to do something. Their belief in God was God is supposed to do what I want him to, instead of I'm supposed to trust God regardless of the outcome, regardless of if I get my way or not. And that's like the hard part of actually being a Christian, is trusting God through hard situations. Um, but like I said, I think that's where the issue, I guess, of suffering comes into play, because I think I would argue personally that God uses suffering to grow people's faith, but you also there's a beauty, not a beauty in suffering. Like when you're suffering, it's horrible, but there's something about suffering that makes you a lot more grateful for the good things in life. And that's something that I feel like I've always um it gives you an appreciation for life that you would not have. We take life for granted when we're not suffering. But when you've been through trials and tribulations and you experience good, you really appreciate the good things in life when you've been through suffering. Someone who's never suffered takes a lot of the good things in their life for granted. They don't appreciate it as much. I feel like you also grow in a way and mature. Suffering allows a type of maturing that just doesn't happen otherwise. And it's just like the tell old question, why do bad things happen to good people? um is essentially the the biggest argument, I guess, that is used against God. I can't believe in a God that allows bad, evil, harmful things to happen to good people. And the truth of the matter is, we live in a fallen world because of sin. The bad things that are happening are often the result of, evil things, evil people wishing evil things and using their free will to do evil things to other people. It's like sin begets sin begets sin, but people don't want to acknowledge that sin, the sin as the problem. They just, God, blame God for everything. So a lot of there's never personal responsibility is never given to people. But I think one thing that's helped me with that specific situation is just recognizing that, in all honesty, no one is promised tomorrow. Not one person is promised any day on the earth at all. And I feel like that's not the answer people like to hear. That's not the answer people like, because that just sounds so like, oh, I guess I'm just supposed to be grateful. But it's like, yes, you should be grateful that you have life at all. You should be grateful for every breath that you get. Um I think um just another way I think about it too is I feel like here on this earth, we're able to experience goodness, both goodness and suffering. And I feel like this is to help us know and understand goodness and appreciate the good things in life. And I think, like I said before, suffering allows you to truly appreciate the good things. Um, when I'm going through a painful experience or when I'm sick and miserable, I'm like, Lord, I need to appreciate when I feel well, because being sick sucks. It sucks so bad, right? So I feel like it's a perspective attitude that also matters. When a loved one passes away, it also shows you should appreciate the people in your life while you have them, because life is not promise. Life is short. Life is not guaranteed to everyone. And the unfortunate truth is people die, people pass away. Every person on this planet is going to die at some point. And the more we pretend like death is not certain, because death is certain for every person on the planet. I don't know what um I've never really considered posing this question. What is the I guess, why do people die, from a, I guess, scientific explanation standpoint? I've never really looked into that. It's just like everyone's just always knows that everyone dies. But no, I mean, how many people have really questioned that? Anyways, I feel like if you never think about death, if you never think about dying, which I guess is an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people, we don't want to think about it. But to be quite honest, I've thought about that for a long time. And I always say, the more you think about your life, the more you, I don't know, the more you question things in life, the better well rounded of a person you'll be when it comes to just having answers to some of those questions. But, anyways, I think that's like that is the hard part, I feel like, for any person experiencing suffering in this world. It's what you choose to do with that suffering that shows, I guess ultimately your faith. Um, if you have true faith, if you have real faith, or for a lot of people, though, sometimes the answer to that question is no. Your faith in God isn't as strong as people pretend it is. And I think that is, you know, I don't know, just like it's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. I, however, always pose this other question because it's often, God can't exist because there's suffering and people get cancer. Like, if God doesn't exist and all of this suffering still exists in the world, how do you reconcile that in a world where God doesn't exist? Because to me, at least with God, there's a purpose, a meaning to suffering, and there's also an end to suffering. I honestly believe, any child that dies is automatically going to heaven, for one. A child that is too young to understand the gospel, which God loves children more than anybody, but a child that's too young to understand the gospel is just going straight to heaven when they pass away, and they're going to be in a place 10 times better than here on earth. So sometimes I think when you're not a Christian, you don't have that hope or that belief system. So it's just like God just took my child away and I'm just left here suffering without them. But on the other hand, for me as a Christian, it's like I see that child, I believe that child's in a better place here on earth. And what gives me hope for that is that there's testimonies of people who've died and gone to heaven and talk about how heaven was the best experience they've had, and they never wanted to come back to earth after experiencing heaven. So that's what gives me hope for that. I think that you only have when you look at this life here on earth as being the only life you'll ever have, that's why people get upset about all of the suffering here on the earth, because they don't see there being any end to it. But the hope that I feel like my faith gives me is that there is an end to suffering, there is an end to death, there is an end to evil. That's the story that the Bible gives us, and that's what the conclusion of the Bible tells us, that there's an end to all of the evil things, there's an end to all of the suffering, there's an end to Satan, there's an end to evil, there's an end to death. So that's what Christians are looking forward to we're like, when Jesus comes back, he's going to put an end to all of these evil things. But I feel like when you reject Jesus, when you reject God, when you reject the Bible, you don't have a hope for a future that I guess it's not promised. At least the hope is that, I guess, as technology progresses or as humans progress, that there will be this change in the human. And this is, I mean, I don't know if people think this far into it, but I mean, I don't even know what the solution. Like I said, I never hear an alternative solution to all of the suffering on the earth in a worldview that doesn't believe a God exists. Like, how do we end the suffering that's happening regardless? If God does not exist and people are still suffering and kids are still dying and people are still suffering, because I almost feel like the people who talk about suffering, it's a way for them to honestly like blame. It's slightly a way to blame God, but I also think it's just like, they're angry at God, at their once held belief in God is what they're angry about. And they never actually look past to, okay, well, if I don't believe God exists but they're still suffering, how then do I reconcile the suffering happening in the world? And what do you then say is the solution to all of the suffering we see in the world? Is for, I guess maybe it turns to like science to come up with cures to cancer, but then it's like, think about all of the things that happen by chance, like car accidents. Like, what's the chance that a tree would fall on a child's head at random? There's just there's so much unknown. You can't really predict anything. Life is unpredictable. And honestly, how I honestly view it is that God is, because we have free will, God doesn't control our choices, but He knows where our choices lead. So God is looking at all of these different choices that people are making, seeing where those choices lead those people, and trying to basically say, look, I know the outcome of all of the choices you are going to make, because I think people when people say God can't be all knowing if we have free will, I think they misunderstand how that works, because I feel like God can be aware of all of the choices we make freely and know the end goal of them, because God exists outside of time, even though we're conflicted to time. So God already knows the outcome of every choice every person on the planet will make, which means he knows the choice to reject him leads to death and leads to suffering. And because God knows that, he's trying to prevent all of these people from suffering, but he also knows he can't make people choose his ways. And that's the sad reality of, I guess, the gospel. But God is basically, limits his power over us by allowing us to have free will. I think that's another, I feel like, aspect of Christianity that really is not well understood. It's like God can't be all powerful if we have free will. Just because God limited his power over creation by giving us the gift of free will, doesn't mean God's still not all powerful. So God is looking at the world, seeing all the choices people make. He knows where those choices end up, where we end up after making all those choices. And so God allows things to happen because he's looking for, how can I turn this situation for good? But God uses everything for good and for the good of those who love God. And so all things, when the Bible says, there's a verse in the Bible that says, all things work together for the good of those who love God. That is true for those who love God. But those who don't love God will have a hard time seeing how all of the suffering and all of the evil and all of those horrible things happening in the world come together for good. Because you have to love God in order to see the goodness that can come about in a world full of suffering. So, yeah, that's my thoughts.